The sound of the hammer. It was supposed to be just a joke between friends, but at 3 in the morning, the sound of something hammering upstairs cuts the silence in the house that had been empty for years. I never had much to believe in these things, but what happened that night made me question everything. The idea was simple: spend time with friends and record one of these 3 a.m. challenges to make fun on the internet. Ethan had the idea. He was always obsessed with weird things and abandoned places. The house was in the most isolated part of the city, on a plot full of dry trees and bushes. It was a place no one frequented, even during the day. Me, Jake, Chris, and Tyler just met on the spot, kind of by pressure, you know. I took a flashlight, but Chris insisted on taking only the camera, saying it would be authentic. When we entered, the smell of mold and rotten wood was the first thing that hit. It was a heavy feeling in the air, but we laughed and moved on. After all, it was just a joke. Everything started to get weird after the clock on Ethan's phone called exactly 3 o'clock. We were in the main room, an empty place with peeled walls and a broken fireplace. Suddenly, we heard 3 loud beats, as if someone was hammering wood upstairs. We stopped at the time. It was so clear that it seemed impossible that it was just the wind or the noise of the old house. It must be some animal, suggested Tyler, but no one was replaced. Chris, as always, wanted to play the brave and went up the stairs with the camera. He said he wanted to get something unique for the video. We waited downstairs with the lanterns pointed at the stairs. I swear the sound stopped at the exact moment it disappeared on top. The silence was so dense that I could hear my own breath echoing in the house. We waited for a few minutes, but Chris did not come down. We called his name a few times, but he didn't answer. Ethan started getting impatient and said he was going to climb, but Jake held him. If it was anything serious, he would have yelled at me by now, said Jake, trying to fly quietly, but I could tell he was just as uncomfortable as the rest of us. That's when we heard it again. The hammered. Only this time, they didn't come from upstairs. It was as if they were all around us, but the walls vibrated slightly, as if they absorbed the impact. I approached the fireplace, trying to understand where it was coming from, and it was when I noticed something that made me freeze. Hammer marks were appearing on the wall right in front of me. 3 marks, deep and fresh. I almost fell back. Ethan and Tyler came running to see, and as soon as they got there, the marks just stopped showing. It was as if the wall was alive somehow. We looked at each other, not knowing what to do, until Jake said, "Where's Chris?" It was at that moment that everything collapsed. The ladder looked darker than before, and none of us had the courage to climb. Ethan picked up a camera that was on the tripod and started recording the ladder, as if it would protect us from something. We decided to go out. Simple as that. The feeling that it was beyond any explanation won us. But when we looked at the front door and around it, it was as if something had broken inside me. Tyler turned to me and asked, "Who's Chris?" At that moment, I realized that none of them knew who I was talking about. I thought it was a joke. Tyler and Ethan kept asking me how I had invented Chris, but I knew he was there with us. He came in with me. He was climbing those stairs. I remember his face. I remember the backpack he carried. But when I started writing this for them, they just shook their heads, confused, as if I was crazy. "We came just the 3 of us, man," Ethan said, his voice a little shaky. It scared me in a way I'd never felt before. I started to insist, almost screaming, that Chris existed, that he was real, but it seemed like they couldn't remember anything. until the video that Ethan had recorded before it all started showed nothing but us three. No sign of Chris. I wanted to go up the stairs to prove that he was there. Against everything my head screamed not to do, I started climbing. Each step seemed more rotten and scary than before, but my determination was greater than fear. I called his name several times, but the only answer was silence. When I reached the top, the corridor was empty. The doors of the rooms were half open, showing only darkness. Then at the end of the hall, I saw something that froze me to the bone, the hammer. He was there, lying on the ground, exactly where the sound had stopped. It was old, rusty, as if it had not been touched for decades. And even then it looked used. I can't explain, but the energy of the place was so heavy that it was hard to breathe. I couldn't go further. I rushed down the stairs, trying to process what I had just seen. The hammer was still fresh in my mind, and the feeling that it should not be there was almost overwhelming. When they got to the room, Ethan and Tyler were silent, looking at something on the wall. They said nothing, only pointed, and my stomach was a knot. The hammer marks spread across the walls of the room, but now there were not just three. They were rare, deep, as if something was trying to cross the wood. I wanted to get out of there as soon as possible, but I couldn't move my legs. It was like the house was holding us. Ethan finally broke the silence. "This is wrong. Very wrong." Tyler just shook his head, not taking his eyes off those marks. We decided to run. I had nothing else to do there. We opened the front door and went out into the cold night, breathing as if we had just escaped from a fire. But the terror was not over. When we looked back, the house looked different. The windows were dark, but I could have sworn that I saw something moving behind the glass, like a slow shadow watching us. Tyler left my arm and said to leave at once, but I stood there, still in that house, trying to find an explanation. Deep down, I knew I didn't. The worst part was when we got to the car. Ethan started checking the footage on his phone, and that's when I saw it. In the video, we were alone. Not only that night, but from the beginning. There was not a trace of Chris, neither on the way home, nor in the room, nor in the staircase. It was as if he had never existed. That silence in the car was unbearable. Ethan and Tyler didn't say anything else, but I knew they were as messed up as me, even if they wouldn't admit it. My heart was racing, and my head was spinning trying to understand what had just happened. When we got home, I ran to my room and started digging through everything that could prove that Chris was real. Looked for photos, messages, anything. Nothing. His number was no longer in my phone. Not a single conversation in the group we have on WhatsApp mentioned him. I opened my social networks, went as far as I remember having taken a photo weeks ago, but the photo did not exist anymore. It was as if he had been disconnected from my life, but I knew he was there. I feel it in the bottom of my chest. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to ask about him to other people, mutual friends, but no one knew who I was talking about. Each attempt only made me look more crazy. For a while, I even thought that maybe I had invented everything, but how to explain what happened in that house? The marks on the walls, the hammer upstairs? I'll never go back there, and I'm sure that neither Ethan nor Tyler. Sometimes at night, I still hear those sounds in my head, the rhythmic hammering, like an echo coming from somewhere far away. Even today, when I think about it, I feel that same weight on my chest. I don't know what happened that night, but I'm sure it was something we shouldn't have moved. And Chris, I know he exists, even if no one believes. The call in the mirror. My friend said it was all nonsense, but when he started screaming in front of the mirror, I found something was terribly wrong. I'm not the kind of person who believes in these things, but what happened that night changed everything for me. It was an ordinary Friday, and my friend Josh came up with a genius idea. He watched a video about a ritual involving a mirror and a candle. "It's just an urban legend," he said, laughing. We always made fun of these things, but that night he seemed different, more serious, almost obsessed. He insisted that we had to try, so I agreed. We went to the bathroom of his house because it was the only place that had a large mirror and could turn off all the lights. Just going in there, the atmosphere already seemed strange. The burning candle smell mixed with that heavy silence made me uncomfortable, but I didn't want to show. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the morning when he lit the candle. The oscillating light illuminated his face in a way that seemed wrong. He began to repeat the words of the ritual, reading a crumpled piece of paper. At first, everything seemed normal, but gradually something started to change. The air got colder, and his reflection in the mirror was no longer synchronized. It was subtle at first, but you could see that the reflection moved with a small delay, as if it were a lag recording. I stood there staring at it, while Josh kept looking in the mirror. Then he suddenly stopped talking and was completely still. I called him, but he didn't answer. That's when he started screaming. His scream didn't seem human. It was a bit desperate, as if he was selling something I couldn't see. He did not move, just kept looking in the mirror, while the reflection seemed alive. I know this is absurd, but his reflection, not only was he late, he seemed to look directly at me as if it were news that I was there. I can't move. My legs were locked, and the phone in my hand was shaking so much that I could barely hold the recording. It was then that the candle went out. Not by a breath or something. She just went out in an unnatural way, as if someone had turned off the light. The bathroom went dark, and I could only hear Josh's heavy breathing mixed with my own emotions. When I was able to light the flashlight of my phone, he was no longer there. The mirror was empty, and the bathroom looked bigger than before, as if the space had been distorted. I started calling for him, but only heard the echo of my own voice. Panic took hold of me. I ran out of the bathroom and started searching the whole house. I shouted his name a few times, but it was as if he had disappeared completely. His phone was thrown on the floor, still recorded. I took the device, and when I looked at the screen, I saw something that made me freeze. The video showed Josh stuck in the mirror. He was banging his hands on the glass, shouting soundlessly as if he were on the other side, in a place where no one could reach him. I wanted to believe there was some kind of mistake in the recording, but it seemed too real. In the video, you could see his face desperate, eyes wide, and hands pressed against the glass, as if he was trying to get out of there. I can't stop looking at the screen. At times, the mirror background in the video seemed to change. It was no longer the bathroom of Josh's house, but a dark, empty place, as if it were an infinite space without walls or floor. I hung up my phone and tried to convince myself that it was not possible. But even then, the fear was almost suffocating. It was as if the bathroom was still watching me, as if I was being drawn back to that mirror. I can't stay at home anymore. I took my things and ran to the street, trying to breathe. I didn't even have the courage to look back. I spent hours sitting on the curb, waiting for dawn, with Josh's phone in his hand. The next day, I called the police and told them that he had disappeared. Of course, I left out the mirror part. Who would believe it? They searched but never found anything. Later, the researcher called me to return the phone, saying there was nothing useful in it. When I opened the device again, the video was simply gone. It was nowhere in the gallery or in the backup. It was as if I had never existed. Even today, when I see a mirror, I feel like something is watching me back. And the worst is that I know that Josh is still there, stuck in that place where no one can reach him. The clock that stopped. Everything seemed normal until we realized all the clocks in the house stopped at exactly 3 o'clock. I was never much of a believer in paranormal things, but that night something changed. We were at Dylan's house, a place that always had a weird vibe of being old, with those long corridors and doors that vary by anything. The idea was to make one of these internet challenges, where each person is alone in a room at 3 morning to feel something. Of course, no one took it seriously. Dylan, me, Marcus, and Tyler were more concerned about shooting a funny video than actually finding something strange. Each of us got a cell phone to record everything and a flashlight, because even playing, none of us wanted to be in total darkness. Everything was quiet until the clock stopped. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate, as if someone had paused time. My phone was exactly 3 o'clock, and no matter how much I tried to update or restart, it did not pass this time. The room I was in seemed to have gotten colder. I can't explain, but the air was dense, difficult to breathe, and I started hearing a low sound, almost like a suggestion coming from the corner of the room. Only that when I pointed the lantern, there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself that it was just the pressure of the challenge, my head playing tricks. But what happened next made me make it up to you. After a few minutes, I started to feel watched. It wasn't paranoia. I knew there was something in the room with me. The flashlight lit up every corner, but I had a feeling that something was behind me. The sound I heard before, that conversation, now seemed clearer. It was as if someone was trying to say something, but not form words. By this time, my heart was already pounding, and I just wanted to leave, but I knew that everyone would give me a hard time if I was the first to give up. I stood in the middle of the room, trying to concentrate on my breathing and ignore that growing discomfort. That's when I heard footsteps. Not in my room, but in the hallway. Slow, drawn, as if someone were walking around the house. When the challenge was over, I left the room almost running. Tyler and Marcus also stopped being nervous, and Dylan, who always played the bully, was pale. They all started talking at the same time, trying to tell what they felt. Tyler said he heard laughter in his room, but when he looked, there was no one. Marcus spoke of a shadow that crossed the front of the window, even with the curtain closed. Dylan was quiet for a long time before finally saying he picked up banging on his room door, but when he opened, the hallway was empty. The weirdest part was when we realized that all our phones still dial 3 o'clock. No matter what we did, the clock just wouldn't go. We decided to watch the recording to try and understand what happened. Dylan connected the cell phones to the TV in the room, and we started watching one by one. Tyler's video was the first, and right away it got weird. The sound of laughter he had thought was real. It was there, but the scariest part was how obvious it was to be in the room. You couldn't track where they came from. When he pointed a flashlight at the corner of the room, where he said there was nothing, the camera caught a movement. Something went too fast to identify, but it was there. Marcus' recording was even worse. The moment he lit the curtain, I could clearly see a shadow forming behind it. It was large, human, but still. Only when he opened the curtain, there was no one. It was my turn, and honestly, I was trying to prepare for the worst. In the video, I could hear the inspiration that I had indicated, only it was taller than I remember. It almost looked like a voice trying to form words, but could not. The moment that made me freeze was when I turned the lantern to the corner of the room. For a moment, a face appeared in the background. Pale, no eyes, looking directly at the camera. I paused the video on time. "What is that?" someone asked, but nobody had an answer. It was like that thing was there all the time, and I hadn't noticed. When we finally put the video of Dylan, we all were in absolute silence. Dylan's video started normally. He was sitting in the corner of the room, clearly trying to act brave, but I could see that he was uncomfortable. His room seemed darker than the others, even with the flashlight on. During the first few minutes, there was nothing strange, but then came the beats that he had specified. They were rhythmic, like someone knocking on the door. 3 bangs, a pause, then 3 more. In the video, Dylan proposed and went to the door, filming everything. He opened slowly, but the hallway was empty. It was when he returned to the room that things really got bad. The video started to fail, with small flaws and distortions in the image. And in the corner of the mirror that was on the wall, something began to form. It was a face. It wasn't his or anyone else we knew. It looked distorted, like it was being pulled or crushed. The figure in the mirror does not follow Dylan's movements, but he stared at him. He did not see it. In the video, I could see him sitting again, while that thing was still in the mirror. It was only in the last minute of the recording that Dylan seemed to notice. He looked directly into the mirror and froze. The face began to approach the surface, as if trying to get out of there. That's when the video ended abruptly, as if it had been cut. We all remained silent for several minutes after that. The feeling in the room was of pure dread. Something in that house did not want us to be there. After watching the last video, nobody could speak. The face in the mirror didn't look like something we could explain or ignore. The feeling that it was watching us, even outside of the video, was almost palpable. Dylan, who was always the most skeptical of all, cried from the couch suddenly and said he did not want to discuss it anymore. He went straight to the room, as if he wanted to be alone, but no one had the courage to leave him there. We arrived in the room, still trying to understand what we saw. Tyler suggested deleting the videos, but I refused. Something told me that it wasn't just about us. It seemed bigger, darker. However, when we reviewed the videos again, they were just not there anymore. All the cell phones were working normally, but the recordings had disappeared. It was not a technical error or problem. The files disappeared as if they never existed. We tried to search the history, backups, anywhere, but there were no traces. Dylan came back to the room at that moment, of course, as if he had seen a ghost. "You need to get out of here," he said in a trembling voice. No. We didn't ask questions, we just obeyed. On the way home, no one said a word. To this day, I don't know what really happened that night. But every time I look at a clock at 3 o'clock in the morning, I feel that same cold in my chest, as if time could stop again. And deep down, I know that thing is still there waiting. The voice in audio. We laughed when we first heard the recording, but when the voice said my name, the dread took over. I never thought that a simple experiment could go so wrong. It was supposed to be just a night of jokes, something to kill time and scare us a little. Me, Ethan, Jake, and Ryan decided to do a recording session at 3 a.m. to try to capture supernatural children. Inspired by videos we saw on the internet, we took an old recorder of Jake, a very old thing that his father used for interviews. The idea was simple. Each of us would say something on the recorder while we asked questions to the beyond, and then we would listen to the audio to see if anything strange appeared. We were laughing and making fun from the beginning, without paying much attention to what we were doing. The clock was 2:58 when we turned off all the lights and started. The recorder was in the center of the room, on an old wooden table. We sat in a circle with the only lights coming from our phones. Ethan was the first to speak. He asked silly questions like, "If there is someone here, give a sign," or "What's your name?" We all laughed as he tried to look serious. Then it was my turn. I asked simple questions, but I felt a strange shiver as I spoke, as if the environment had become colder. Jake, who was always the most skeptical, started to joke, saying that this was all a waste of time. Ryan ended the recording with a no-fun joke, and all demos laughed. We turned off the recorder and decided to listen to the audio at the same time. That's when everything changed. At first, the audio seemed normal. We could hear our voices, the wood of the chair squeaking, and even some sounds from outside, like wind or branches banging on the window. Everything was quiet until it came to the part where Ethan asked his questions. It was subtle at first, but you could hear a sound in the background, almost like a slow breath. Ryan and Jake started laughing, saying it was probably some noise from the old recorder, but I couldn't take my eyes off the phone screen while playing the audio. When it was my turn on the recorder, the sound became clearer. It wasn't just a breath. It was a voice. Weak like a suggestion, but it was there. I paused at the time and looked at the others. "Did you hear that?" They were silent for a second before agreeing. Someone or something had answered. We rewind the audio and turn it up. This time, we heard the voice clearly. It was not male or female. It was distorted, as if it were coming from far away, but the words were clear. "I am here." The mood changed completely. Ryan, who was laughing until then, got serious. Jake started to say it was some kind of interference, but no one seemed to confirm. The room got colder, and for a moment I felt like someone was standing right behind me. A continuous recording, and the moment Jake started to joke, the voice came back. Only this time, she said something that made my blood ice. "Jake." She said his name. Not laughing, not shouting, but in a calm way, almost as a warning. As soon as we heard the voice say Jake's name, the tension in the room became unbearable. He tried to laugh, but I could tell he was pushing. "It must be a coincidence," he said, nervously confusing the recorder. No one answered. We are back to play the audio, now with all senses on alert. The moment Ryan closed the recording with that no funny joke, which changed completely. It was not just our voice or the distant voice. It was a low, serious noise like a buzzing that began to increase until it became almost unbearable. And then, in the midst of the hum, a voice came again, but this time clearer. She said, "It will happen," and then silence. A silence that seemed greater than any other sound. We turned off the recorder at the same time. Jake spoke, nervous, and started walking back and forth. "That doesn't make sense," he said, almost screaming. Ethan and Ryan were so clear that they weren't affected. I didn't know what to think, but I knew something was very wrong. "That will happen" was hammering in my head. What did it do? We left the room hurried, each taking his things without saying a word. When I got home, I lay in bed, looking at the ceiling. I can't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice again. And then the next day, I got the call. It was Ethan. He panicked, talking too fast, almost impossible to understand. "Jake had an accident," he mentioned on the phone. My heart has popped. I asked what had happened, but all he knew was that Jake had left home on a motorcycle that morning, and was hit by a truck at an intersection. Ethan went to the hospital, and I promised to meet him there. On the way, the words of the recording echoed in my head. It will happen. It was impossible not to connect things. When they arrived at the hospital, Ethan and Ryan were already there, sitting in the waiting room, looking shocked. Jake was in surgery, and the doctors said that the situation was serious. While we waited, nobody talked much, but the silence said everything. We knew that it was not just a coincidence. Ethan finally cuts the silence. "Do you think it has to do with what we heard?" Ryan looked at him, scared, but did not answer. I didn't want to believe it, but it was hard to ignore. The voice had said Jake's name. She had warned. We spent hours there, and when the doctor finally came to talk to us, the mood was already so heavy that we could barely breathe. The labyrinth of the basement. I was right behind him, but when I went down the stairs, he just wasn't there anymore. I never got to tell anyone this, but I feel like I need to put it out. It was last summer when me and my best friend, Josh, decided to explore an old house in our town. We have always been curious and loved this kind of adventure. This house is on the outskirts, near an abandoned field, and everyone said it was haunted. Of course we didn't believe it, but it was the perfect place for an adventure. We planned everything, flashlights, cell phones to record, and chose the most cliché possible time, 3 a.m. It was supposed to be just another funny story to tell later, but it turned out to be the scariest night of my life. The house was already chilling from the outside, with those broken windows and a door that looked close to falling. When we came in, the smell of mold and rotting would almost made us give up. But Josh, as always, insisted. On the first floor there was nothing interesting, only old furniture and a lot of dust. That's when I found the basement door. It was small and ringier when we opened. The ladder that went down seemed endless, plunging into a darkness that even our lanterns could not completely overcome. Josh went ahead, laughing and saying I was being soft for hesitating. I went right behind, but every step seemed to take us further away from the rest of the house. The air got colder, almost cold, and I started to feel that something was wrong. When we looked down the stairs, the room seemed bigger than it should. The basement was not just a simple space. The walls were far apart, as if the place was much larger than the house allowed. The lanterns lit up a little, and the light seemed to be swallowed by darkness. The ground was full of dirt, stones, and some marks that seemed deep. Josh seemed excited, pointing the flashlight everywhere and making comments about the strange size of the place. But I can't relax. I felt that something was watching us. The feeling was so strong that I looked back several times, hoping to see someone, but there was nothing. That's when Josh saw a door. It was old wood, with rust marks on the handle. He opened it without thinking twice and went in. I hesitated, just answered. The room we entered was completely different than we imagined. It was not a common basement, but a long and narrow corridor with walls of raw concrete. The lantern barely lit up the end, and the echo of our steps seemed to multiply, as if the corridor was larger than it looked. When Josh turned to one side, I went back, but in a matter of seconds he disappeared. "Josh!" I called, but only the silence answered. My heart popped. I ran down the corridor where he had entered, but it seemed like I was going in circles. It was as if the place had changed. The more I ran, but lost, I stayed. The corridor seemed endless, but somehow it bent over itself. I turned right, then left, and just came back to a place that looked identical to the point where I had started. Only now it was different. The walls were closer, as if they were closing slowly. I called Josh's name again, yelling this time, but the only thing I heard was the echo of my own voice. The feeling of being distributed increased. It was not so unpleasant. It was as if something was analyzing me, waiting. My flashlight started to fail, blinking, until it went out completely. That's when I really panicked. Groping in the darkness, I found a wall and kept touching it, trying to keep calm. But the wall seemed to pulsate. It was not solid as concrete. It was hot, as if I were alive. I pulled my hand immediately, feeling a nausea take hold of me. The ground looked scary now, as if it was sinking slightly under my feet. I started running, even without knowing where. Suddenly I heard something. It was a low sound, like deep breaths coming from all the exits. That's when I heard the scream. Don't know how to describe it, but it sounded like Josh. Only his voice was distorted, almost unrecognizable. I followed the sound, but it didn't seem to come close. It was as if the cry was being touched away from me, taking me further into that impossible maze. I was sweating cold, my breath out, and panic began to take hold. I kept walking, trying not to think of the idea that maybe I would never leave. It was when I saw something along. A faint light, blinking, as if someone was holding a flashlight. I ran towards her, shouting Josh's name, but the closer I got, the more I realized it didn't make sense. The light seemed to be moving away, as if it was taking me deeper into that place. The walls began to change. Now they were no longer concrete, but of a dark and damp stone, as if the whole place had been designed for some kind of cave. The smell also changed, getting heavier, a mixture of mold and something metallic, almost like blood. Finally I got to the light, but it wasn't Josh. It was his lantern, lying on the ground. The beam was pointed at a wall where something was written. It was not in English, nor any language I knew. The letters were distorted, almost like symbols. I can barely breathe. I took the lantern and looked around, but the place seemed even more empty now. And that's when I heard the sound. Steps. Heavy, slow, coming directly behind me. I turned around at the time, but saw nothing. The sound was approaching, but there was no one there. I did not wait to find out. I ran in the opposite direction, leaving the lantern so strong that my hand hurt. Everything inside of me said I needed to get out of there, but I didn't know how. I ran as never before in life, without caring about the echoes of my own or steps with walls that justify closing more each second. The flashlight flashes intermittently, and every blackout I was sure that something was right behind me. I no longer heard the footsteps, but felt a presence. It was as if the air around me had become denser, almost impossible to breathe. Finally, I saw something that looked like a ladder. It was there, but it wasn't the same way we went down. He looked older, covered in rust and almost crumbling. I didn't think twice. Climbed as fast as I could, almost slipping on the unstable steps, while that feeling of being applied became stronger. When I got to the top, everything was even more confusing. It was no longer in the basement. I was outside, lying on the sidewalk in front of the house, as if I had been thrown out. My flashlight was on my side, off, and the sky began to clear. I felt stunned, trying to understand what had happened. The door to the house was closed, and everything seemed quite quiet. That's when I realized Josh wasn't with me. I shouted his name several times, but there was no answer. The house looked empty, but in a wrong way, as if it was watching me. I did not have the courage to go back. I called the police and told them that my friend was missing, but they omitted everything that happened downstairs. No one would believe. When the police arrived, I was sitting on the sidewalk, shaking. They asked me a lot of questions, but all I could tell was that Josh had disappeared in the basement. 2 officers entered the house to search, while I stood outside with another officer, trying to explain what had happened. After a while, the 2 came back. They said there was no sign of a basement. I froze. I insisted that the door was there, that we went down together, that Josh had disappeared downstairs. But they looked at me like I was crazy. One of them even went to check the floor, but there was no sign of a staircase, much less an underground space. It was as if the basement had never existed. I spent days trying to understand. The police classified Josh's case as missing, but it seemed like no one really believed my story. I searched the internet, trying to find something similar to what happened at home, but only found bizarre theories and reports of people who also got lost in places that changed shape. I don't know what happened to me that night, or how I got out of there, but I do know Josh is still there somehow. And the part that torments me most is that sometimes when I close my eyes to sleep, I can still hear those footsteps. They're closer now. The creature in the window. I thought it was just the shadow of a tree, but when it started moving, I understood that we were not alone. I still feel a chill in my spine every time I remember that night. It all started as a joke between friends. Me, Mike, Tyler, and Noah were trying to make a live video for the 3 a.m. challenge. The idea was simple. Spend the night in an abandoned house, ask scary questions, and try to capture something strange on camera. We chose a detached house in the suburbs, known to be haunted among the residents. We arrived around 2:30 in the morning to prepare. We took flashlights, cell phones, and a tripod to hold the main camera that will broadcast everything live on Tyler's channel. The mood was tense, but we were more concerned with entertaining viewers than anything supernatural. When live started, we had about 20 people watching. Tyler narrated everything while Noah and I explored the rooms. Mike stayed in the main room, adjusting the camera on the tripod. Everything seemed quiet for the first 15 minutes. We asked typical questions like, if you have someone here, show a sign, or who lived in this house. The usual basics. But it was when Noah pointed a flashlight at the window that things started to get weird. He froze for a second and called me a little. In the window, there was a shadow. At first it looked like just the reflection of a tree, but it was very clear, as if it had a humanoid shape. I laughed nervously, trying to ease the tension, but before I could say anything, the shadow moved. The shadow does not move like normal. It was slow but fluid, as if it were sliding through the window instead of walking. Noah was paralyzed, and I could only whisper, "Did you see that?" Tyler, who was on the other side of the room, saw our event and came running with the camera. He was directed to the window, but the shadow had already disappeared. "It must be the branches of the trees," he said, trying to fly calmly, but I could see that he was also uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the comments on live have suffered an accident. People were saying they had seen the same thing, and some even said that the shadow seemed to be inside the house. Mike, who was still in the main room, converging from nowhere, "Guys, come here. Now." We ran into the room, and he was pointing at the cell phone monitor connected to the main camera. In the live stream, the camera was focused on the corridor next to the staircase. The place seemed empty, but in the corner of the screen a figure began to appear. She was dark, taller than a normal human, with disproportionate arms that almost dragged on the ground. The face, or what seemed to be a face, was indistinct, as if it were blurry. "Is that in the hall now?" he asked, but no one answered. We looked down the corridor, and of course there was nothing there. But in the camera, the figure was standing still, as if it was watching us. At that point, the live was boiling with messages from viewers saying, "Get out of there now, and this thing is behind you." The room was completely silent. Only the sound of the live notifications filled the air, but no one had the courage to say anything. Tyler tried to adjust the camera angle, but the picture on the screen remained exactly in the same place, even when he moved the tripod. It was as if not being recorded by the camera, but inserted directly into the video. Noah, with a shuddering voice, suggested we leave the house, but Tyler wanted to keep going, saying that this could blow up the channel. I approached the corridor, against everything that my head screamed not to do. When I lit the place with the flashlight, there was absolutely nothing. But on the monitor, the figure started moving. She wasn't walking. It was as if she were floating, sliding towards the camera. I backed away, almost tripping on the furniture as everyone in the room started to panic. "Turn it off!" Mike shouted, but Tyler hesitated. Before I could decide, the live stream froze for a second, and then the camera zoomed involuntarily, focusing directly on the face of the figure. It was the worst thing I ever saw. No eyes, just two dark cavities that seemed endless. The mouth was a distorted slit that moved erratically, but without emitting sound. Suddenly, the transmission was cut off completely, leaving only a black screen with static noise. When the transmission cut, the room plunged into absolute silence. Nobody moved for a few seconds, as if we were trying to process what had just happened. It was Tyler who broke the silence, desperately trying to restart live on his phone. "What was that?" he muttered, but no one answered. The phone was no longer connected, and the camera seemed dead, even when it was on power. Noah started walking around, saying we had to get out of there, but Tyler insisted on staying, trying to justify that it was just a glitch in the video. It was then that we heard a sound coming from the corridor. It was a slow drag, as if something was being pulled down the floor. We all froze, staring at the empty corridor. The sound kept getting louder, closer, but there was nothing there. Took the flashlight and pointed it at the end of the hall. The beam of light seemed to be swallowed up by darkness, as if the space was larger than it should be. Noah took a step back, knocking down a chair in the process, and that's when we saw it. The figure was standing at the end of the hall, but this time it wasn't on the screen. It was there, really. She was even taller than she looked in the video, and her arms almost touched the ground. There was no movement, but everything in it seemed wrong, as if it was out of place. When her head leaned slightly to the side, as if watching us, Tyler finally shouted, "Run." It was chaos. We ran to the front door, but it seemed like the whole room was getting smaller, as if the walls were closing in. Tyler was in the front, trying to unlock the door, but the key did not turn. The sound of that thing dragging its arms in the corridor continued, closer and closer. Noah started banging on the door with both hands, screaming, but nothing seemed to work. I turned back for a second and saw the figure standing in the middle of the corridor, closer now. The light of the lantern flickered, and the creature seemed almost pixelated, as if it did not belong to the real world. Her mouth began to open slowly, but still without emitting sound. It was when the door finally gave way, and we all ran out of the house. No one looked back. We only stopped when we arrived at the street, panting, trying to understand what had just happened. Tyler dropped the camera on the floor and started crying, something I had never seen before. Noah was in shock, shaking his head repeatedly, as if trying to convince himself that it wasn't real. It was only when we tried to review the video live on mobile that we realized the worst. There was no recording. The transmission had been completely erased, as if it never existed. But the strangest thing was that while we were fiddling with the phone, it locked for a second and showed a single frozen image. It was the creature, staring directly at the camera with its mouth completely open. After seeing that frozen image, the only thing we could do was to drop the phone and move away, as if it was contaminated by it. Nobody wanted to touch it again, but Tyler, still shaking, grabbed it and tried to erase the image. It didn't work. Every time he opened the gallery, that same photo appears, even if we didn't take any. We decided to leave the phone there, in the street, and just left. We returned to our homes in complete silence, as if talking about what happened would make everything even more real. But the feeling of being observed did not leave me from that moment. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that blindfolded face and distorted mouth. I thought it was just the trauma, until, around 3 a.m. the next morning, my phone vibrated. It was a live notification. When I opened it, it was from Tyler's channel, but he wasn't broadcasting anything. The screen was black, with the same static sound we heard before the broadcast cut in the house. And then, for a fraction of a second, that creature appeared on the screen, staring directly at me. The live dropped soon after, and since then none of us have been able to talk about it. I deleted all social networks and blocked Tyler and Noah. Not out of anger, but because I feel that if I connect with them again, it will come back. And honestly, I don't know if I can face it again. The alarm of nothingness. It was my phone's alarm. It had never rung at 3 o'clock in the morning before, but that day, it woke me from a nightmare that seemed too real. I never believed in coincidences, but what happened to me in the last few weeks makes me question everything. The first time the alarm rang was on a Tuesday at 3 a.m. I woke up scared because I never set alarms for this time. In fact, I don't usually use alarms since I always wake up at the same time to work. Took the phone, still half sleepy, and tried to understand what was happening. But when I looked at the screen, there was no alarm programmed. The sound had stopped as soon as I unlocked the device, and there was no notification history or open apps. I thought it was strange, but I was too tired to think about it so much, so I went back to sleep. The next night, it happened again. This time, it was worse. The same alarm rang, exactly at 3 o'clock, but this time I woke up from a nightmare. I don't remember the details, but I was in a dark place, surrounded by trees, and had a horrible feeling that someone or something was watching me. The alarm sounded like a distant sound in the dream, as if it was pulling me back into the real world. When I woke up, the feeling of dread was still there. My heart was racing, and the room seemed colder than usual. I looked at the phone again, but there was no alarm record or notification. I stayed up for the rest of the night, trying to understand what was going on, but without any logical explanation. On the third night, I decided that I needed to understand what was going on. Before going to sleep, I deactivated all notifications, closed the background applications, and turned off the alarm option on my phone. I thought that would solve it, but at 3 o'clock sharp, the sound played again. This time I wasn't sleeping deeply, but had a strange dream before waking up. I was in an open field surrounded by fog. Everything seemed surreal, as if I was there, but not really present. There was a figure in the distance, still, and when I tried to approach, I woke up with the alarm. The phone was on the table next to the bed, vibrating with that sound. I had no idea where it came from. When I unlocked the device, it looked normal, as if nothing had happened. That's when I started to write down the details. Every night, the dreams became more intense and real, and always ended with the same pattern. I in some unknown place, with a crushing feeling of fear, an alarm waking me at the most tense moment. One night I dreamed that I was in an abandoned shed. The walls were covered with graffiti, and the floor was wet with something that looked like blood. I heard a sound coming from a door, but before it could open, the alarm rang again. After this dream, I decided to search the places I saw. I took the most striking details and started to search on the internet. It was then that I discovered something that made my stomach turn. The places of my dreams were real, and all were connected to cases of deaths or disappearances. The first location I searched was the last dream shed. It was not difficult to find something like that, because the graffiti on the walls I saw in the dream were very specific. I found out it was an abandoned warehouse in another city, known to have been the scene of a brutal murder some years ago. A woman had been found dead there, and the case was never solved. What made me more disturbed was that the images of the place were exactly as in my dream, up to the details of the graffiti. This could not be a coincidence. I continued researching the other places of my dreams and discovered equally macabre stories. A park where a man disappeared without leaving a trace, a house where a suspicious fire occurred, and even a famous intersection for fatal accidents. All real, all horrible. After that, I started to get paranoid. I started to avoid sleeping, afraid of what was coming next. But even in the nights I resisted, the alarm still sounded at 3 o'clock, as if it did not depend on whether I was sleeping or not. It was then that I decided to record my room during the night. I put the phone in a corner, with the camera pointed at the bed. When I woke up the next day, exactly at 3 o'clock with the alarm, I hung up and went straight to watch the recording. Most of it was just silence, but something appeared the minute the alarm started to sound. In the video, I was lying still, but a shadow passed in front of the camera. It wasn't mine. She looked tall and thin, with slow movements, almost floating. When the shadow disappeared, the alarm stopped. After seeing the recording, I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to delete the video and pretend that nothing of it was happening, but at the same time I needed to understand what was happening to me. I decided to show the video to my friend Ryan, who is a computer technician and understands a little bit of video editing. He watched it several times, analyzing every detail, but could not find anything that indicated a manipulation. That's not a camera flaw, man. Whatever it is, it was in your room. Those words stuck in my head all day long. When night came, I could not sleep. I sat in the room with all the lights on, waiting for the inevitable. And as always, at 3 o'clock, the alarm rang. But this time it was different. The sound seemed louder, closer, as if it did not come from the phone, but from inside the house. I took the device, but it was not vibrating. Even so, the sound continued. That's when I realized the noise was coming from the direction of my room door. My heart pounded. With the flashlight of the phone, I lit up the corridor, and the sound stopped immediately. I stood there for a few minutes, paralyzed, waiting for something to happen. But everything was quiet. Back in the room, and I sat on the couch, trying to calm down. It was then that the phone vibrated. It was a notification, but not from a known app. On the screen, a single phrase appeared. "Are you seeing now?" When I read that message, I felt a shiver so strong that I almost dropped my phone. Are you seeing it now? It was as if it knew exactly what I was doing, as if it were there with me. I tried to unlock the phone, but the screen turned black and did not answer anymore. My instinct was to leave home, but I was so scared that I could barely move. I felt the same strange cold that I had already felt in dreams, that dense, heavy air that seemed to fill every corner around me. The only thing I could do was to look at the door of the room again. It was half open, and for a moment I saw something there. A shadow, tall and immobile, but sharp enough to make me freeze. Don't know how, but I managed to run to the front door without looking back. I left the house barefoot, with my phone still in hand, and sat on the sidewalk, trying to catch my breath. I called Ryan, not even knowing what to say, but he didn't answer. I spent the rest of the morning sitting there, waiting for the sun to rise. When I finally came back inside, I found my phone working normally, as if nothing had happened. There was no record of the notification or alarm. I erased all videos and deactivated the device completely. But the worst came the next day when Ryan called me. He was scared, saying that he had dreamed of me. In the dream, I was standing outside my bedroom door, looking at him, but my face was distorted. You just stood there standing still, but the shadow behind you, man, that looked alive. Since then I can't sleep. And at 3 o'clock, even without an alarm, I always wake up. The door that did not open. I swear she was there. I saw the door close in front of him, but when we tried to open it, there was nothing left. We always thought it was just another one of those internet stories, until the day we decided to test it on our own. Me, Ethan, Jake, Tyler, and Mason went to spend the weekend in a small town, famous for its urban legends. The goal was simple: visit haunted places and film everything. It was Tyler who found the hotel. He said that there was a specific corridor on the 3rd floor where strange occurrences had been reported: footsteps, doors that slam alone, and most famously, a door that disappeared. Of course we didn't believe it, but it seemed the perfect place to end the night. We arrived at the hotel around 2:30, rented a room on the 2nd floor, and went up, already with the cameras turned on. The corridor was ordinary, but something in it did not seem right. Maybe it was the dim lighting, with bulbs swaying on the ceiling, or the absolute silence, as if the entire floor was empty. Mason led, pointing the lantern at the numbered doors. There was something strange about the numbers. They were not in sequence. Door 304 was followed by 310, and then 305, but no one commented at the time. We were laughing and teasing each other, trying not to take anything seriously. It was when we noticed a door that seemed older than the others, with the paint worn and no number. "That must be the famous missing door," Mason said, laughing. He tried the handle, and to our surprise the door opened. Before anyone said anything, he came in. As soon as Mason entered, the door closed behind him with a loud slam. It was automatic. We ran to try to open, but the handle did not turn. Jake started knocking on the door, shouting his name while Tyler filmed everything. "Mason, open it," but there was no answer. The weirdest part was when Tyler tried to show us the recording. The camera had not recorded anything. In the video, there was no door there, only a flat wall. We looked at each other, confused, but panic began to grow. I took the lantern and lit up the area where the door was. There was nothing else. No crack, no sign of an opening there before. It was just a wall. We stood for a few minutes, trying to understand what had happened. Ethan suggested that we had imagined everything, but it was impossible. We saw Mason come in, heard the door slam. We started looking for him in the hall, knocking on all the doors, but nobody answered. The whole floor seemed deserted. Jake called reception, but the woman on the other side insisted there were no other guests on the third floor. When he tried to explain about the door, it was silent for a moment before saying, "You should come down now." That gave me a chill in my spine, but nobody wanted to leave without Mason. We kept looking for another hour, but it was as if he had evaporated. We decided to go down and tell the reception. Maybe Mason had gone out another door without us noticing, or it was all some kind of ill-planned prank. But we arrived in the lobby, the receptionist stared at us with a strange expression. "Are you sure you saw someone enter that door?" she asked, almost as if she knew something she didn't want to say. Tyler explained it all again, but with every word she seemed to get more nervous. Finally, she said, "This corridor has been closed for years. No one should be there." My stomach turned. It was impossible. We were there. We saw Mason go through that door. When we insisted, she refused to help us, asking only that we leave the hotel. We went back to the room completely shaken. Tyler did not stop watching the recordings, but it was as if the camera had edited the videos itself. There was no sound of the door, no image of Mason coming in. Every time I tried to remember exactly how it had disappeared, my mind seemed to blur the details. We spent the rest of the night in the room, quietly, waiting for Mason to show up, but he never came back. The next day, we give the recordings to the police and tell them everything. They searched the third floor, but found no door like the one we described. The case was closed as a missing person without explanation. But the strangest thing happened years later. It was about 3 years later, when everything seemed to be in the past, that I received a letter. No return address, but the envelope looked old, with a rough and yellowish texture. Inside, there was only a folded sheet of paper with some handwritten words. I recognized the letter immediately. It was from Mason. My heart popped. The message was short and confusing. "I'm fine. Don't look. The door is closed." It made no sense at all. The last time we saw Mason was that night, coming through the door that disappeared. I showed the letter to Tyler and Jake, and they were as shocked as I was. But what really upset us was the detail that came later. At the bottom of the letter, Mason described a place. He spoke about foggy fields and a homeless house where time does not pass. The problem is that none of us recognized the place. We decided to search the internet, playing the words in Google, but all we found were images and reports of people describing something similar, but always in dreams, as if the place was not real, but something that only existed in another dimension. The detail that still haunts me is that the envelope had no seal or stamp. There was no way the letter could have been sent by normal means. It was as if she had just appeared. After we received the letter, something changed between us. Tyler and Jake began to avoid talking about Mason or what happened that night. Each went on with his life, but I could not forget. The letter, the disappearance, the door that did not exist, all this was hammering in my head. I decided to investigate further. I spent weeks researching the hotel, rummaging through online files and forums about the paranormal. That's how I discovered something that froze my blood. The third floor of the hotel had been closed for decades, after a fire that killed several guests. Among the reports, there were stories of a door that appeared and disappeared, always linked to people who were never seen again. I took that information to Tyler, but he refused to listen. He said it was my head, and that I should leave the past behind. But something in the letter of Mason kept calling me. I decided to go back to the hotel alone, with the intention of finding some answer. When I arrived, I was surprised to see that it was closed, with no entry signs and windows covered. Even so, I managed to enter through a side door. The place was abandoned, but the third floor looked exactly as I remembered. The corridor was there, and to my horror the unnumbered door too. It looked even older, with rotting wood and deep cracks. I stood still, staring, with the feeling that something was watching me from the other side. As I stared at the door, a mixture of fear and curiosity took hold of me. Part of me knew I should get out of there, but another part needed to understand what had happened to Mason. With trembling hands, I touched the handle. It was cold, as if it had been dipped in ice. When I turned the handle, the door opened without making a sound. What I saw on the other side was impossible to describe completely. It was not a room, nor anything I expected. It was as if the space behind the door was another place, a surreal landscape. There was a dim light, as if it came from a cloudy sky, but there was no sun or roof. Everything was surrounded by a dense fog, and on the ground I saw footprints that seemed to lead to nowhere. I stepped in, but the feeling was instantaneous. It was as if the air were heavy, pulling me down, making every movement difficult. Suddenly I heard something behind me, a low, familiar but distorted voice. "Why did you come?" I turned around, but there was no one. The door started to close slowly, and when I tried to run back, it was too late. The last thing I saw was the hotel corridor disappearing as the door closed. The dim light went out, and I was caught in that oppressive darkness. Now as I write this, I don't even know how this message is going to get through to you. All I can say is, don't look for the door. And if you find it, don't go in.